Did Nick leave again? Has anyone seen the presenter? No? Okay. It's okay. We'll go without him. Oh, there you are. Alder, you're ready to pick it up if he faints all the way up, right? Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. It is, I believe it is February. Oh, yeah, I got to get close to the microphone, don't I? I'm still getting used to that idea. I'm allowed. Yeah. Well, I know, but he's recording it.
We can hear you.
Can you? Just barely? Okay. So we're in February. Nick Muhonen is back. Woo! We looked it up. Nick is the third most prolific PadNug presenter we've ever had. Wow. Hanselman's one. Who was number two? Was it Jason, maybe, right? Back when he was D. Then Nick Muhonen. Very few people have presented at PadNug as many times as Nick Muhonen. And that's because he's so awesome. You know this.
That's right.
Got a lot to live up to tonight, Nick. Anyway, just remember what we've said now, what we've done for you. So PadNug is on Meetup. It's also on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Somehow I've got to find a better way to consolidate this down so we don't have to share all these links all the time. But I don't know what that is yet. Any ideas, feel free to share them. Maybe not right now. But.
Holy
How about a web page?
A web page. Huh. Now, if we can figure out a way to do that, I'll
a rough crowd.
I'll see. Do you see one of those links might be a web page? Just,
That's hilarious. That's some revolutionary technology.
maybe we could do a phone tree. I'll call 3 of you. You could call 3 of your friends. You call 3 of your friends. We'll do it that way. Oh, and did anyone notice that there's PadNug stickers up there at the on the counter?
Nugget,
Yeah?
baby.
Yeah.
Nugget.
I expect at least this many stickers to be gone by the end of the night. At least. And you can take 2 if you want. They're small. Anyone not get the guest code yet? Darren, you have the guest code. You don't need to take a picture of this. Anyone else? Going once? Twice? Did someone just ask for? Oh, no. Okay. I hope you got to see this. This was today's Dilbert. I found it very useful. Okay.
Yeah, that's me.
What's that, Nick? Sitting down during the stand-up will ruin your software, just so you know. Microsoft, that's why we come here. Intel provides this wonderful, luxurious place for us to meet. Thank you, Darren. Dun, dun, dun. Darren, what are you doing way up there? I'm not used to this. This is weird. Who's going to be James' backup guy? And SureWeb provides the space we use for our website. That does, in fact, exist. Even if we do a lot of stuff elsewhere. We get stuff to give away. Thirsty Lion and Nona Amelia's provided some stuff tonight. We did not get the JetBrains this month, so I got to do some checking on that. On the other hand, we always get some great stuff from these folks, and that is pizza, because these people make pizza possible. Whoa, that's tough. 15 IT resources. I know you're here. Where are you, Chuck? There you are.
Yeah, right here. I'm Chuck from 15 IT Resources, account manager. We do IT staffing and data science instruction and training. And with us, our rate is $15 per working hour. That never changes. The idea is that we take less of the wage to get more of the wage into the pockets of our consultants and our clients. And also, real quick, new meetup, data science for the Beaverton and Hillsborough area. That's the last Tuesday of every month. Check it out, meetup.com. Look it up, machine learning and data science for Beaverton and Hillsborough.
Cool, very nice. Vanderhouen.
Yeah.
Tyler or Andrew?
Sorry, let me put down my laptop.
What?
Hey guys, I'm Andrew with Vanderhouen. Happy to be here. I've been coming here for a long time. We have a few different things going on in Portland. The .NET market is not as hot as it was like a couple of months ago, but that doesn't mean it won't change. I'd love to chat with you. My cards are out front, and my buddy Tyler is coming here as well. He may be going to the afterwards, but I'm going to add him. Hey, Tyler.
Hi, Andrew.
Anyways, yeah, hit us up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I did see Tyler. Sorry, I didn't warn you. Sure ID. I know we have,
Winston from SureID. I'm in talent acquisition there. We are a premier provider of identity management and assurance solutions for the military and beyond. We're growing. I don't know what Andrew's saying. I mean, our .NET market is pretty hot at our company. So we've got a senior software engineer opening. We've got a senior front-end engineer opening. Come find me afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. Silence, is that going to be Eric tonight, or?
Yep.
I hear your voice.
Do
There you are.
security at the endpoint and infrastructure. It's going to be based in Irvine, California, where we've been growing like crazy, more than doubled in the last year. We're hiring mostly SDevs right now. I think we've got a couple of dev positions open. And please check out the website.
Thanks. Enough. By the way, that's a good point. I don't usually call attention to, but if you go to PadNug website and see the supporters page, there's a link to every one of these. So if you need help finding the place, then that's where to go. IT Motives. Nick.
Running the show myself here today for IT
That's
Motives.
weird. IT Motives, only one person.
A lot of new positions open up, a lot of C#.NET positions, mainly like senior, lead, and some like principal level positions, not as much on the front end, DevOps, QA positions. Please do get in touch with me. I'm going to be at the after hours for a little bit, and just one tidbit for those of you that haven't talked to lots of recruiters, get to know at least two of us. None of us are going to be able to work on all the same positions. You're really doing yourself a service if you reach out to us and get to know us early. So love to talk to you.
Thanks, Nick. Home Depot. Joe, is that going to be you?
Sure.
Excellent.
Yeah, the Home Depot Quote Center. We're over in Vancouver, Washington. We're one of the fastest growing dev shops, I think, in the area. We're doing a lot of hiring. We have open positions for devs of all levels, including lead positions. We're hiring SRE, that's Site Reliability Engineer. So working on cool projects, and we're growing fast, and we're going to take over an industry. So join us.
Excellent.
And all these people here, raise your hands.
Woo!
Ask any of these guys, we paid them to lie to you.
Or you could continue to pay them if they, okay. Anyway, Tech Systems. Natasha is not here this evening. So, Danielle, thank you for being here.
So I'm not replacing Natasha, but she is moving to Phoenix.
Or are you?
She got an exciting new opportunity to be the trainer for recruiters. I'm the newest member of the Microsoft space with Tech Systems. I'm sure you all know that we're the nation's leader in IT staffing and services. I will also be at the after party, and I'm here to network and
Very cool.
meet as many of you as I can. So we see.
Make sure she wants to be our person, even if Tech Systems not. Make her beg for it, folks. Make her happy to be here tonight.
Don't make me beg for it.
Well, I mean, this is a fun group. You could do worse. You could get worse duty than this one. Anyone from Robert Half tonight? Yet? Okay. There are at least one or two other people here who have something. Stephanie, you're one of those people.
Great. So hi, my name is Stephanie. I have a software company. My software company's name is Aggregation Solutions. We make child welfare software, and I've been looking for you guys. I have a position for a full stack developer that I'm looking to fill, and it's a good work from home opportunity. Work with a small growing startup, but a mature startup. Yeah. Thank you.
You should talk to our presenter tonight. Anyway, anyone else? Anyone else? Going once, twice? Okay. Coming up soon, Squawg is in a couple days. No, that's tomorrow, isn't it? Anyone got this lowdown on Squawg this month? I don't, so. And Angelo's not here. He usually has something. Okay. Docker Portland on Thursday. PortlandMobile.net in a week and change. That's the Xamarin Group, in case you don't know that. Agile PDX that same night. Geek Dinner in 2 weeks from tonight. That's the Washington Square one. And then the Portland SQL Server User Group. I noticed that Tim has gotten involved in that, and it's starting to be a lot more active and planned ahead and stuff, so that's kind of exciting. Then 3 weeks from tonight is the Downtown Geek Dinner. Those are always fun. Portland Typescript on the 28th. Jen, you want to
Don't have a topic yet? It'll probably be something I'll pick.
I think it's monthly meeting is your topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a kind of an oddly named feature instead of TypeScript. We'll make an announcement soon.
Cool.
Maybe something around React and TypeScript. We'll see.
Excellent. Well, I'm at Valley Software Engineers. I don't know. Anyone get down to Salem for that on occasion at all? You did, Jared? Did you go this month?
Not this month.
Okay. Things got screwed up because of the snow, though. So maybe they'll reschedule Dave Harrison, maybe for next month. And then next month is Padnug. Olga Kogan. Is there an Olga here? No. Hey, Olga.
Hi, everybody.
Next month's presenter, right there. Next month's Nick. And then Lauren Paulson will be back down to visit us from his new Digs Up Microsoft Way in April. So we actually have most of the year booked out. And if you go to the meetup site, you'll see them. Even if they're not fully published yet, you're going to start seeing them fill in real quickly. So then afterwards, several of people have mentioned going to the after party. If you'd like to too, throw up your hand and leave it up for a few minutes. Probably you want to go because it is awesome and wonderful. Okay, see how all your hands went up after that? Yeah. Stephanie's going twice, in fact. That's awesome. So I'll give them a holler and make sure they know how many people are coming or about how many people. And with that, Mr. Muhonen, would you like to come on down and do a great presentation?
Sure. I'll give a presentation. It's audio.
Woo!
Did you get all the hot mic stuff I was saying afterwards? No. Oh, fantastic. What good stuff. Good stuff there.
This whole live stream, we're actually live streaming tonight? Or, not, or just recording?
live streaming.
Oh, we are? Oh, okay.
Wow.
Watch the live stream if you're in the building now.
Yeah, because we might interrupt
Right.
the live stream if you watch the
We
live
want as much Wi-Fi as we can do.
All right. How's everybody?
Doing great.
Good? Yeah? That's awesome, Charles. You came out like something good's going on over there. So thanks for coming tonight. I know it's not really directly Microsoft, but it's great to have so many people who are interested in JavaScript. So I figured I would start by talking about the brief history of JavaScript. Everybody familiar with the brief history of JavaScript? Okay, not a lot of responses. That means no. So I'll go ahead and start. So a long time ago in the 80s, somebody named Tim Berners-Lee came up with this concept where you can share all this related information by a protocol in a language. The protocol was HTTP, and the language was HTML. And the idea is you have all this declarative text that is linked to text that could be physically in a different location. So this doesn't seem like JavaScript, right? Because it really has very little technically to do with JavaScript. Yet it has everything to do with JavaScript. So there was this browser that was first made by these people called Mosaic. Anybody heard of Mosaic? Yep. It's a long time ago. It's like in the 80s, right? Woohoo! So Mosaic was this interesting browser, but there were some people there that had the entrepreneurial bug that said, we're going to fork it and start our own browser. And they came up with this thing called Netscape. You heard of that? Yep. Okay. So they thought, we got this thing that professors are using to share papers with one another, but that's not really that interesting to the general consumer. So we got to do something to kind of spice it up. So you go to some content and it's neat, or it does something interesting. So there was this other company that was working on this hot new language that used to be called Oak, but then they changed it to Java, and they're called Sun. Have you heard of these guys? Right? And so they worked with Netscape and came up with this concept called an applet, which was you have this really rich language which you compile into binary code that you then load up into a browser with this deployment process for setting it up with a bunch of static assets. And this is a great idea, but Netscape thought, well, maybe there might be some developers out there that just might want to, when you click on a button, to change the background color. So there was this developer there named Brandon Ike. Remember this guy? Heard of him? Right? They said, Brendan, I think, why don't you come up with a language to do some very basic scripting development, and we'll give you about a month. Literally, about a month. So he comes up with something called LiveScript, which is basically kind of a functional programming language in a imperative or a functional programming language and a procedural language's clothing. So it's kind of Lispy, but it looks like Java, right? Because you can do things like functional programming. And he slips it in there, and the marketing people at Netscape say, well, we've got this hot new commodity Java we're working with, and we've signed off on some trademark agreement with Sun, so we're going to call it JavaScript, right? And that created confusion for recruiters for many years after that. Okay, so we've got this new language called JavaScript. Now there's this other company, the slide's gone, you've heard of them, they're Microsoft. And they were getting into this game too. They were like, this is really good stuff, this browser stuff, it's going to change everything. So we're going to come up with our own version of Java, but we can't call it Java. So we're just going to use the J, and we're going to call it J++, and we're going to integrate it with our awesome component framework called COM, which is going to live for centuries. And believe it or not, it still has. It's still out there. And we're going to create this language called JScript, which is like JavaScript, but it's also going to work with COM, and it's going to live for centuries, and that's actually very true. Well, what was interesting is that now we have these two major players in the browser wars. The first one, I guess, are they even wars now? They're just browser competition, right? But there was a big war, and there's a lot of heat around it. They were trying to customize this language in a way to make their browser a little bit better. Well, the end result was you end up with a language that you really can't write well for all the browsers because each browser is getting too specific. So everybody saw the problem with this, and they got together under a truce flag and worked with the committee, or a standards body called ECMA, and came up with the first version of Ecmascript, which is basically the bare bones compatibility layer of definition of how JavaScript should work, what its syntactically and semantically is with a language, how things are going to run, what its standard library is. So they go through a couple of versions of this, right? And around Ecmascript version 4, they decided that we're going to make this language like Java. We're going to have packages, and we're going to have classes, and it's going to be object-oriented. And we pushed this standard out, and basically all the browser manufacturers said, well, people are just using it now not to change background colors, but to now do basic validation, so it's too much. So it really never went anywhere. At the same time, a couple years later, some apps start coming out that change things, that use this new or old API that Microsoft introduced called Ajax. So now you can actually use this language to build rich experiences that are full clients and actually do a lot of stuff. And things start evolving. And so the standards body, now known today as the TC39 group at JavaScript, say, okay, no one's digging this object-oriented JavaScript. It's just too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll all that back, and we're going to add a couple nice new features, and we'll call it Ecmascript 5. And so up until 2015, that's probably what, if you're writing in JavaScript, you've been coding in, which is Ecmascript 5. It's the standards body that everybody uses, the standard everybody was using. And so there were some great, neckbeards that came up with these interesting concepts of how to write proper JavaScript. So like Crockford-style JavaScript, I don't know how many of you have written stuff like that. All sorts of cool things, and like revealing module pattern becomes kind of a dominant way to do things. And at the same time, while everybody's using this, new frameworks are coming out, and it becomes clear that the language syntactically, although you can do all these great things with it, is kind of losing a common thread. So for instance, if I wanted to use an object-oriented framework in my language, you would pick a library, and they wouldn't be compatible with one another. Or if I wanted to use a module framework with this language, you would pick a library, and they wouldn't be compatible with one another. So the powers that be, now years after the browser wars, are all kind of working together saying, what are the features that we can add to move it up, move the standards up so that these things are kind of built in syntactic to the language. And they released it last year, actually 2 years ago in 2015, called Harmony, or Ecmascript 6. And Harmony is the ongoing feature set that's being involved. So this year, last year, 2 years ago, last year, and this year, Ecmascript is now in a process where we're actually iterating releases annually. So Ecmascript 6 can also be referred to as Ecmascript 2015. Last year was 2016, and this year upcoming is 2017. So hopefully, what I'll be able to demo is where we're at with Ecmascript in 2017, and I hope you like it. So that's all I got as far as history. That's mainly accurate. So kind of a caveat, I was thinking I would do something fun, and it didn't work out, which was I was going to try to get Bash working and do all my development process through Bash, but there's an issue between opening up an editor and saving files in the Bash in the Linux subsystem. It doesn't work so well, so we're going to just use good old command prompt, and I hope you won't be too sad about that. Okay, so let me go ahead and open up some Visual Studio Code. And so as far as the presentation is concerned, right, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Since the Ecmascript 2015 standard has come out, most of the browsers are now actually getting about 90–95% there, as far as the browsers that are constantly refreshing themselves, the evergreen browsers. But there's still a couple things that aren't there that are getting there but aren't there, such as standard modules. That's, Jordan, that's for you, the shruggy. You're welcome. So that's something to keep in mind if you're doing modern JavaScript development. So in order to get all the features, you can't just run it in the browser. You have to run it through some tooling, unfortunately, but they're getting there. It's getting closer. As far as the demo is concerned, I'm basically going to go through features of the JavaScript language. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through a lot of them. I have some non-standard code that just is informative. There are two functions called title and show. That's not standard JavaScript. But everything else is pretty much standard JavaScript without any extra modules or anything else. I'm going to be using Webpack. How many of you people use Webpack? Okay. So the main reason I'm using Webpack is because I've been using it a lot lately. You could also use System.js. There's also an ES6 polyfill module loader. But I'm going to be using Babel behind the scenes, which you can use with System.js. But I'm also going to be using things that are basic module rollup so that everything else is just running on the browser. And so for that reason, I've decided to use Webpack. Okay, I'll be doing a live reload setup. And then at the end, we'll have one feature that I'll be able to show you using the latest version of Ecmascript, but it's not out yet. And as far as to show the demos, this is all going to be in a repo, so I put some instructions up, if you care, to load these down later, just if you want to see some examples. There's also some great literature out on the web that's probably even better than this. But just in case you care, that's that for you. So let's go ahead and start with some basic stuff. So I'm going to show you my environment. And so for the most part, what we're going to do is we are going to open up a command prompt and go to where my source code is at. D:. Boy, it's been a while. CD develop, CD repos, CD pad nug. There we go. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is basically have an NPM environment running on the command prompt, and I think that's all we really need. For the command prompt? Yeah, you got it. It's a little small. Boom. How about 18? All right. Does that work? Okay, cool. So what I've done is I've installed Webpack, and that's all I'm going to use, and it's basically driven through some config files. This is the main one that I'm going to this is the one that I'm going to use for the main demo, and then later on we're actually going to switch to this one, which is going to use Babel as an intermediary transpiler to do some of these latest and greatest features. So in order to get that working, I've installed globally both Webpack and Webpack Dev Server. And in order to run it, I just basically need to type in Webpack Dev Server. And it's going to read from this config file. Now, it might just blow up on this one because it won't be able to find the bundler. But that's exactly what it's meant to do. So with that, I'm going to also show you the environment which we're going to run the demos in. So I'm going to do localhost. And this guy is what's being served up from Webpack. And so I'm also going to then open up some tools. And we will now basically see the output. So this is our environment. This is what we're going to be looking at for pretty much all the demos. Everybody clear with that? Webpack's running in the background. I'm going to copy some code. It's going to show it do stuff. And we're going to talk about each little bit of code. All right. So let's start with the first stuff, which is some of the basics, sorely missed things from previous versions of JavaScript that finally made it into Ecmascript current. So let me go ahead and start off with the let keyword. Okay, so there we go. Everything's working. Fantastic. Okay, so here's a basic example of the let keyword. So previous to Ecmascript 2015, to declare variables, you use the keyword var. So the difference between var and let is what? Hoisting, which means what is the scope of the variable? Where is it declared? It's declared at the function scope, meaning that if I declare a variable anywhere within the function, whether it's within a block or not, it is available for the entire function body. So let me show you. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of presto change up of my code. Change this to var. Click save. And you will see that even though in the outer scope I've declared first and last being Nick Muhonen, I've redeclared first being Izzy, which I haven't really redeclared it. I'm just using the same variable. And because when I do that within the first scope, you can see this if true statement, this guy has now been changed to Izzy. Now it doesn't look like that in code. It looks like, well, within the scope of this, we've just changed this to somebody else's first name. But that's actually how hoisting works. And that's what let fixes, right? So I change that back, and you can see that. Let me make this bigger. How do I do that? Yeah, there we go. Is that good enough for you guys? Can you read that? How about we do some of this? We do. Settings, theme, dark. We'll make it a little bit easier. Is that easier to read? Yeah, okay, I figured that would help. Okay, so it does make a difference, and this is really super awesome. Now you can actually just arbitrarily declare variables wherever you want. You know, for Crockford-style JavaScript, it was decided that you have one var keyword at the top. You do all your variable declarations. You initialize them if you need to, and you never declare anything else any other where, or else your linter will fail. Now that's not an issue anymore. You can just declare a variable and use it, which is great. Okay, so that is let. Let's go ahead and move on. Oh yes, so you can't reassign it with let, but you can redeclare it within a scope. So you'll notice that I'm using first twice. The first in the if true block scope is a different variable only local to that block. All right, so let's go into const. Good point, thank you. All right. Control C. Chris Sell said he was going to come here and be the monkey for me. He did not show up. So I'm going to have to get him later. Okay, boom. Let's see. Okay, so const is pretty much the same thing, right? Nothing too different there. You know, we have first and last again locally. The main difference with const is once you assign it, you cannot reassign it. Let's not uncomment that part, because that will break everything. But if I save this and actually take a look at it, you'll see, look, you can't reassign that const because it's a const. All right, so my code these days, when I write JavaScript, everything by default is usually a const. And then if there is a variable that needs to be reassigned later, I use it as a let, but generally that's what I do. So I worked with Jordan here, and we've got he actually got our style guide from Airbnb, which is a great style guide if you're interested in learning more about JavaScript. Very good JavaScript developer. Okay, so let me go ahead and talk about destructuring, one of my favorite subjects. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this guy, put it in the main. Okay, so let me go ahead and take a look. And so if you take a look at here, destructuring is kind of interesting. I have a value, and I want to take it and assign it very quickly to a bunch of variables without having to do a lot of verbose coding. And so if you look at the first example, I have a value that's an array, and I want to take its contents out and just assign it to some other stuff. So here we have a couple variables, or 3 variables, first item, second item, and rest. And I'm just assigning them to some stuff. First and second are going to be integers. ... Rest is going to be an array. Very good. Okay, you can do the same thing with object literals. So in the second example, I have an object literal. I am assigning that to first, last, and then I'm also assigning hair color to be a default value if it's not being passed. So notice here, if I actually put hair color up there, it would actually be whatever that is. And I don't know why I call it hair collet, but something to remember from the presentation tonight. There you go. Okay, so destructuring, really good stuff. Use it every day. All right. Boy, I hope I have enough content for tonight. I think I do. Okay, so this is really nice. So now in JavaScript, instead of having to, when you're declaring an object literal, if you have some variables that are named the same thing, you don't have to do first colon first, last colon last. You can just name them. And so this is really great for a lot of reasons. One, when you're writing a lot of code, it kind of forces you to use the same language throughout your code for defining ideas. Because it encourages you to write less code, so there's less of a reason you're going to call something first underscore name and then assign it here. You'll just say, well, if it's called here, why would I call it something anywhere else? It makes sense to keep the same concept, name the same thing throughout your code. In dynamic coding, this is very important. I want to say that again. In dynamic coding, having concepts named consistently throughout is very important. Anybody gander why? Because it's dynamic coding, right? You don't have a compiler check to tell you you've assigned something wrong. Now, module imports help a little bit with this, but having similarly named things and a language that encourages you to that reduces errors. So this is a big deal. Believe it or not, it seems small, but it's actually, to me, a really big deal. That's my opinion. All right. Nope, it can be vars, it can be lets. Please don't use vars, by the way. Now that we have let, do not use var. Just don't use it anymore. Just let it go. Let it go. Remember it. Remember like the things you had to do and like this was cool. But I'm not using it anymore and use let. Just use let. Use let. Just suggestion. You can throw some vars in there. Just say, look, I got a var in there, and maybe do a global variable. But I'd say no. Just let go and use let. I have a shirt that says that. I think might work out in the future. But
Does it automatically get them set if you use a let there and then?
it's well. So that's a great question. So that's a great point. So what's your name? Sunny just brought up a really good point. So here we have a const, and here we have an object literal assigned with default values. Okay, those are just normal properties. They're not constants. This is not a mutable type. If you want a mutable type, you'll have to use something like object.freeze. But this is just a way to keep things organized. In fact, most const object literals you can change the values of. It's just one of those things. But at least you can't change the value of the reference arbitrarily. But that's an excellent point. All right. Keep the questions coming. We can add more content that way. Okay, so we're on destructuring, shorthand properties, computed properties. Okay. La 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 la. Wow. Doom ba doom ba doom. Oh, I know. Someone does a lot more Visual Studio Code than I do. I do Atom. And it shows. Visual Studio Code, I got to tell you, I was pretty impressed putting this presentation together. It's come a long way. Oh, look at that. Yeah. Okay, come on. Someone, you do the presentation. I don't even need to be here. So which one? So what do? I do?
Use Windows key and then right arrow.
Windows key, right arrow. Windows key. Okay. So right here. And then right arrow.
Just drag and kind of. Yeah. Touch it onto the right border. No, not that one. The window handle. Not the tab.
The title bar. This one right here? Oh man, you're getting me lost. You know, I'm going to get like a 3 on this presentation. So the Windows handle where? This guy right here? I'm going to cry. Which? Come on up here and show me.
Ladies and gentlemen.
There you go. Thank you. Just give you the lapel. How do you do this?
Where's the Windows key? Oh, there it is.
See? I got this. It's the laptop's fault. It's not mine. You sure? I just did that.
There you go.
Oh.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. So that apparently was really desired in this presentation. I'll remember that. Remember that next time. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of Windows 10 either. Boy, I'm just the shame keeps coming more and more. Okay. So a couple things about computed properties that are interesting. So you'll notice here that I am just assigning some evaluated property equals value. So you could always do this, right? You could always actually create an object literal, instantiate it, and then every subsequent call imperatively say object literal in here, evaluate to something. This just means that when you're declaring it, you can just do it all at once. So if you have a couple of these computed properties, it's nice. I'm honestly not sure. I've rarely used this, but I think there's probably a place where it would make sense. I just haven't. If someone has.
Metadata programming is really popular. If you're trying to do like an ORM, building your own ORM that represents the database, you can create properties dynamically.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, there's an example. I've never needed to do that, but if you are doing that, that might be something you could use. So definitely interesting stuff. I figured I could show it. Now here's something that you will use, I think. At least I think I use. So it's just a nicety. It's not a big deal. Look at that. I learn quickly, you know. I make mistakes, but I learn quickly. Okay. So here we have a method. This is what we call shorthand method properties. And it's very similar to the old way. It's just instead of doing a do-it colon function, open paren, close paren, open squiggly, blah, 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 close squiggly, you don't need to put the function in and the colon in. It's just shorter, more succinct. It's kind of nice. All right. All right, here's some cool juice. Cool juice, people. And I mean sun-kissed cool. Okay, so this is something that is actually huge. This is something called template literals. And you'll notice that I have a string up here where I have a backtick, an expression that actually is escaped into that I can just pop in there with the $ open squiggly, put the expression in a close squiggly. I put a couple of them in there. And you'll notice a couple things. One, it preserves the new lines. And two, because you have this escape, you don't have to get, I rarely run into the issue again, which I always did in my code, which was open single quote value space plus string plus space equals, where I always forgot the space. I rarely forget spaces anymore. So this is actually a very useful feature. You think it's small, but it's a big deal. You're not impressed. I am impressed. Thank you. Come on. You know, after failing before, I need some Nick, you're just doing great up there. You're doing great. Just keep going. Keep going, Jimmy. Keep going. You can make it. You can make it up there. Okay, let's see what else we got. Oh, Rich, that touches me. So, yeah, you know, that's the way that it goes. So I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but I'm going to go into, this should be arrow functions, not array functions, but you know what I mean. Just update the repo later. All right, look at that. I learned. Did it again. Save. Okay, so this is some cool stuff, right? For people who've written C#, this is nothing new. Or written any functional programming, this is nothing new. But it's basically a shorthand arrow function. So this is, you'll notice in the first example, I have an arrow function where it is just like any other function body. It's kind of like declaring an anonymous function, as in the first example. Here we have, the function is, I'm going to pass in a prefix, and I return the prefix with whatever is passed into closure scope, the value, which is padnug. And you will see that that will be hello padnug, because that's the prefix and that's in the closure scope. What's interesting about this, which is really nice, I like, although there are a lot of jQuery people that I've talked to who said, no, this is not great, but I think this is actually great, which is that the lexical this is outside of the scope of that function. So you can't ever use lexical this to an arrow function to point to the function object itself. So you'll notice in the next example, I'm creating an object literal, which is going to create the scope of the lexical this. I have my shorthand function, which is just like a normal non-arrow function, which is scoped to the object literal. And then within there, I have the with prefix again. Yeah, that's why I didn't want to do that, because it's just, do that. There we go. You know, the wrap I didn't like too much. So we have the prefix again, and then I just do console log hello again. When I call literal.doIt, it's going to call, this is going to be of the literal and not of the with prefix function. So that's kind of nice. I like that. I like that, especially if you do a lot of functional programming within type constructs, which I like to do because I like to make my code really confusing. So I actually do like to do that. That's why I'm unemployed. Okay, let me go ahead and move on to
Just a quick note again. With the arrow syntax, you have both an
Okay.
So in the arrow function, all your examples here are implicit returns. You don't have to use the word return. But the moment you put it within a scope, code braces, you do have to call it.
There will be later examples that do that. There you go. But he is correct. So these examples are simple one-line shorthand lambda functions. You can also do, after the arrow, an open bracket, and within that, you can actually have as many imperative statements you want, and then if you want to return a value, just like any method, you put return. So that is correct. All right, but one of the things that I did want to show that I actually think is kind of useful that a lot of people don't get to do so much is this kind of simple transformation, which I think is really neat. So if you have a bunch of stuff and you want to kind of do something and shove it together in an object literal as far as putting together a bunch of properties that you're going to use over and over and over and over and over again, right? You're not just going to assign it once. It's a really simple way to put together a simple function and do that. So if you're like creating models that you're using in code, this is a real nice, easy way to do it, because you're using two concepts. One is the default property assignment, and then we're actually using this arrow function. Notice, to this gentleman's point right here, that if you're doing that, to differentiate between whether or not those are imperative statements and whether or not that's an object literal, you have to enclose that within parens. If you don't, it's going to think it's a bunch of function statements and it will fail. So it's like, what's this comma doing here? I don't know what that is. So just something to keep in mind. I think it's cool. Again, subjective. Yeah, it's basically saying I'm returning an object literal. But because if you don't put that there, it'll think it's a statement body of a function. All right. All right, boom. So here's another cool thing that I like. Okay, wow, that's a lot of stuff. So one of the things that you can now do in JavaScript is you can have default parameter values within methods. And there's a couple ways that you can do this. And depending upon how fast you want your code to run and how verbose or how informative you want your code to be, not necessarily verbose, but informative and easy to manage, you may choose one way or the other. So the fast way is the first way, which is you have some parameters, you pass them in. Some of the parameters may have default values. And you can see here I'm doing hello padnug, and here I'm saying hello padnug, and I'm actually repeating it 5 times instead of 2, which it actually does show on my side-by-side layout here, which I learned about today. Okay. So this is nice if you want to have some default values, but also want a pretty fast-performing function because it gets called and it's performance critical. Maybe it's for rendering. Who knows? Maybe you just want it to be fast because you want to be fast. The second one, I like this. I think this is good news. So let me stretch this out again, and I'll stretch it back, I promise, right? And I learned about this on my last gig because I learned it worked differently than I expected. So here we have, and for the gentleman in the back row, there you go, there's your example, and there's an example right there of a non-single shorthand function. Here we have an example where I'm actually passing in an object literal. And notice I'm destructuring the values of the object literal as I'm passing them in. So they become just simple parameter values, times and some text. And also notice that I have some default values, and I'm also assigning it to an empty object literal. And I learned about this, right? You're like, what? That's crazy. So this is destructuring syntax, right? If I passed in undefined to this, it would blow up, right? So the first call here where it says some text, repeat some text again, that would just blow up. It'd say, I'm trying to destructure undefined, I don't know what it is. So you have to set it to a default value of an empty object literal. And then within that, you want to set its default values to be something. So here we have, I can override some text, and here I'm actually overriding times to be 4. Right? So this is kind of nice because now you have named parameters, which you can read, which make it very clear what's going on in your code when you're looking between these countless files. Again, naming things consistently in a dynamic language, which again is important because it's a dynamic language. So for API, this is super nice. But if it's performance critical, use option A.
So could you have a variable name and then assign that to the object literal in the second one? Like you creating that object literal and assigning it to an empty object, but could you have some object equal?
Yeah, you could assign it to anything. It doesn't have to be that. So if you have like a bunch of something default, that's fine. You could totally do that. You could totally do that. The nice thing about this is that if you put in an incomplete object literal, it will fill in everything. And you don't even have to include an object literal. So it's a little tricky, but this is how you do it. I've learned this.
Now, another question. So, like in C# we have optional
C#.
parameters, right? So does it have to be, when you assign a default value, do they all have to be towards the end?
Well, so that's a good question. So JavaScript is all optional parameters, hence the reason for the default values everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So in the second example, right, I'm not passing any parameters. I'm not even passing an object literal. It's optional. So if it's not passed, we're going to send in an empty object literal, which is then going to get destructured to these two values.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about like in the top one, some text times equals 2. Let's say you have another argument called x, and doesn't have to
I
have a
think
default value.
that's a good question. I don't know.
Does it
I think you
default?
do need to have default values from the back end. You can't.
Yeah, that's
I don't think you can, but I'm not sure. If you did, that would be weird. But I don't know. There could be some reason.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
That could be it.
That's kind of the best practice. But just
That's a great question. One thing to keep in mind that I've learned about modern JavaScript is, unlike the original JavaScript was written by a very smart guy in a month, modern JavaScript was basically debated by incredibly smart people for years for less features. So most of the stuff, if you look into it, I'm like, why did they do that? And they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, unlike in JavaScript, like, why did they do that? And you never get an answer. It's like, you never get an answer. It's like, just do, something like dog equals 12, and all of a sudden it's on your window object. It's like, why did they do that? You don't know. You never know. They'll never tell you. You bet. Fill the content.
You keep saying that the final example, you wouldn't use that for performance critical code. Is that just because of the extra allocation?
Well,
Or
no.
is there something else going on?
There's a lot of things going on. So you're creating an object each time you're making a parameter call. So I don't know what the garbage collection algorithm is. I imagine it's some mark and sweep that optimizes around stack calls. So I imagine this is not going to be. Well, I bet it's generational mark and sweep garbage collection, which optimizes around stack calls. So if it does that, this is probably, I'm betting it probably doesn't, but I don't know. But I do know that you will have to create an object literal each time, even if you're recycling them. And that's still work that the runtime's going to have to do. Where this is, it's just popping and pulling from a stack, kind of. I mean, it depends on how it's compiled. But I don't know. Something for presentation topic, I think, for someone, maybe. Not for me. Okay, so 2. That's a very good question, though. I'm not exactly sure of the performance, but I know that most. So, actually, get back on that. So how many of you write with Angular or have written with Angular? Okay, clearly, it's a Microsoft community, so not a surprise. So Chris Sells, he does come here. He didn't come today, though. I'm going to get him. So one of the things I was reading on one of their blogs years ago is that there's writing succinct code and there's writing performant code. And succinct code is not always performant code. So iterating through items, for instance, probably some of the most succinct code is the least performant code. And I think passing parameters as well can be some of the least performant code as well. But it matters, like, how important is that performance, right? And I don't know. To me, the most expensive thing that happens in a browser is after you append an element to a live document. That's when things slow down. You know, up until that point, I mean, you can run around in circles and call each other monkeys for days, and it's a couple of seconds or a couple microseconds. But as soon as you render, like, you know, Helvetica on a button and need that to be interactive, that's when things start slowing down. So I guess it's questionable whether or not it is, but I think if you do enough of these things, such, you know, Angular is a great example of that. Most of the slowdown in Angular are these watches, right? At least version 1. Version 2, they've made it arboreal, it's better, but Angular 1, those watches were just terrible. And that's just because of the way it was designed. And that was supposed to be well-written code, you know, as far as performance. So it does make a difference. All right, some great questions. I'll have less coffee earlier and more later next time. Doom. Okay, we're on default parameters. Okay, rest and spread. Okay, I had an interview question on this. Is that person here? So I blanked on this interview question, and I don't know why. But I thought it would be funny if they were here. Or I might not have mentioned that I blanked on it if they were here. Because I might have thought I didn't blank on it. And I'd be like, yes, I'm really smart. I'm an Italian man. Lemony Snicket. It's good stuff. Okay, so rest and spread parameters, right? So this is basically how you can call methods and how you can do things with how methods receive your calls. That's really what they are. So here is how you would do rest parameters. Here I'm passing in first and rest, and you will see that it basically does kind of destructuring on the method call because of how the parameters are set up. And it will take the first argument and assign it to be whatever that is, the first value, the first parameter passed. And the rest of the parameters, it just pops in an array and puts it in that rest variable. And you can see that kind of right there with the array equals 4. Now for the spread is kind of the opposite of that. So here, instead of actually within the receiving method call, it is the caller that makes that decision. So here I have a method that takes 3 parameters. And when I call it, I'm going to pass 1 parameter. I'm going to take this array and I'm going to spread them across the rest of the parameters. And you will see that the first parameter is 32, and 2 is 1, and 3 is 2 because of the way that I did this, right? You guys getting that? So this is kind of useful. You know, when I really use this, because I rarely do this spread result where I pass in a value, it's when you're creating a utility function in functional programming that takes an arbitrary number of arguments and then you want to do something with it, such as like low dashes once would be a great example of this, saying I'm going to create a function from a function that when you call it ensures that it only gets called once, but will be called exactly the same way. This is a great way to do things like that. It's a really great tool for that. So low dash solves most of those problems because it's in low dash, but there are cases where I have found the need to do things like that for functional programming challenges within the code. All right. Now let's get into the goodness of templates, because now this was like a build-up to this. Okay, so one of the things you might not have known about these cool template literals is that you can pass them to a function, and the function, if you call it the right way, will take it apart and you can then do something with it. So let's say you wanted to make, I don't know, a view engine. And in that view engine, you wanted to take some literal and then do something with it, right? If you call the function that's going to break it apart in a particular way, which is function name, open backtit, no open paren, just open backtit, pass in your function literal, and then you have the function, okay, you will see that you now have things you can work with. And let me kind of show you this. I think this is neat. Because occasionally I think that I might do something like this. I never do. But first you will see that the data bindings that were passed are all here. These are all the variables that are in the open, in the $ open bracket data binding syntax. So those are all the values that are actually sent. The template comes back as an array as well. And in between each one of those places, right, like between 0, 1, 2, and 3 is where you actually put the data bindings. Right? So you can kind of weave these together and actually evaluate it. So that's the template, right? And that is actually the object literal all evaluated. How do I do that again? Oh, look at that. That's not it, though. Windows right key? No, whatever. Oh, my goodness. So I hold it, Windows right key? Windows key, right key. Right arrow. Well, I just messed everything up. Sorry, guys. So, but anyway, this is good because I want to show this side by side. So, if you look at here, you'll see that I have some carriage return line feeds that are then essentially evaluated to carriage return line feeds. Along with that, there is this raw string, which instead of actually evaluating, just gives you \r\n. So you can really use this as a templating engine. So I think this is kind of like, I see all these things like JSX. How many people do React? Like, it's some cool stuff. I'm going to be doing React soon, it sounds like. So it's neat. I mean, when it came out, React I thought was the bomb. You know, they got away from this really crazy built-in data flow models. They created a very basic view engine, prescribed a really robust data flow model to use with it. But you had to use this kind of parser environment in order to get it to work. And nothing wrong with that, but now I think you can just do these template literals and just do something like JSX, open backtick, put in whatever you need, close backtick, evaluate the properties. You know, I think there's something really, really super nice about, I think there's a lot that can be done with this. So I'd be curious to see what the great JavaScript minds come up with to do that. I just think it's a cool, cool feature.
Another common name for us, tag.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to classes. So classes finally have made it into JavaScript, like real life classes. Okay, so here we have basically a shape, the class called shape. You can see that we have a constructor, which is how you declare a constructor, and we have a method, right? And this is basically something you create, normal way you would do this. So now kind of the idea of creating these prototype functions kind of really don't have much value. If you're really going to create strong types, JavaScript has classes. It's a much cleaner way to represent it. You can do some different things with prototype functions. I'm not sure how valuable they are mixed with object literals, if they really have as much value as people think, but maybe someone will come up with something. They always seem to. So here we have an example of a class. Here we have an example of a calling move. Here we have an example of a constructor. Okay, pretty basic stuff. So let's go on to inheritance. Whoa, there's a lot of code there. Yes, great question. So, good question from this gentleman. So, public by default, yes, there is no access modifiers on classes. Everything is public. Now, what you can do, there's a couple things you can do. Well, there's only one thing you can do, right? If you want to create something that's kind of private, you can use something called a symbol. Right? Haven't you used symbols in Ruby? Right? So what a symbol is it's like a key that you can't normally see with the rest of the keys. So when you say object show keys, or there's a couple other ways to actually iterate through the keys in the API, they won't be by default available. You can still get to them, but you have to try, right? It's kind of like reflection in .NET. You can still get there, but you kind of have to try. So to do that, let's just do it. And I'll just do it real quick here. Now, one of the things about symbols is that most of the concept I've shown you so far are things that you can pretty much get out of any transpiler. This is a runtime concept. Now, transpilers can kind of get them to work, but to really have them so that you have the symbol API to use, you really need a runtime that manages it. So we're going to say priv equals symbol. I've done this a few times in my life. Priv. And then what you can do is, let's say you don't want to show ID to the world. Let's say you want to learn how to type. Boom. You can do this dot priv equals ID. Right? So we're doing a couple twisto changeo things. And if I want to access it from this point on, right, I would actually have to then, do a getter and then pull it out. Now, the problem with this is that this works fine if you just have values. If you start having functionality that you want in private scope, it can get kind of messy. So I think with classes, I've gone back and forth on this. I used to think priv was great. I even suggested it. And I think in cases where it's just containing data, it's a good idea. Like if you have some predefined services you want to hide from the world, totally fine. But if you're doing something that has a lot of embedded functionality, right, just use an underscore. And when most JavaScript developers, when they see the underscore, they know what it is, right? It's like, oh, that's a private variable for me to screw with. That's basically what it means. But you know what it is when you see it. It's like, yeah, I probably shouldn't mess with that, but let's see if it works this time. That's what it means. Okay. You got some really good questions. I'm so glad. Got a good crowd tonight. Okay. So let's talk about inheritance. So inheritance looks very much like, almost like C#, more like Java inheritance, where you have an extends keyword, which then you can then, it will implicitly have an instance that's prototypally inherited that's created when that instance is created. But essentially, it acts much like classical inheritance. You have within there a constructor. You'll see I have the super keyword to actually call the super constructor, right? One thing interesting about JavaScript that's different than C# and Java is that you do not need a constructor if you have a non-default constructor in the base class. It will just call the one in the base class. Just the way it is. I think it's kind of neat because it's JavaScript, and you know, if it's good enough, it's JavaScript, right? That's kind of the state thing I say. But you'll see also that I can also, extend this. You can essentially override the methods too by redefining them. There's no. That's all you can really do is override the methods because you never assign to a base class in JavaScript. Everything's duck typing, right? So there you go. I mean, that's kind of cool stuff. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'll just see. Now, if I move shape, this definition of shape, this is very different than functions. After square, do you think this will work? So if I had a function called, right, these are not hoisted. Very good, right? That will fail. And my next example is going to show you why they made that choice. Because at first you're like, what? Why would they do that? And then the next example, oh, that's interesting. But still, I kind of think, why did they do that? But it's something to keep in mind, right? These are declared within block scope. In fact, you should almost have a semicolon after the end of it, but they don't, right? And if you can actually create class shape and then do an if and create another class shape inside of it and do all that jazz and return back one class or the other. It's wacky, but those are JavaScript classes. JavaScript's a little wacky. It's not like you're from the stewards of object-oriented design. We will do this inheritance model which has implicit scope, or it's just not like that. It's like let's get a little crazy. So that's JavaScript. That's how I feel about it anyway. I believe it is. It is. This is all sugar. But unlike
That's why the constructor thing works, because
in fact, I'll show you a site at the end. it will show you for most of these things there is a Ecmascript 5 polyfill-ish solution where you can do pretty much everything except for a few things that I'm going to show you. But pretty much, yeah, it's just syntactic sugar, but it's a consistent form of syntactic sugar as opposed to, there were a few different object-oriented like classical inheritance libraries. Now you just use this one. And it's nice and clean, except for the weirdness as far as when you declare things. Okay, so, cool guys. So here is the reason why, if you're feeling crazy, you may want to actually care about the fact that these are done in order. So one of the things that you can do in JavaScript, which is great, just awesome. I mean, it's just create some really wild code that's like you think you know it, but then it goes down this path and it does something different. That's JavaScript. This is really that. So you can still do crazy things in JavaScript with inheritance with their constructs. So for instance, if you want to create your own mix-in concept within the language, well, JavaScript doesn't support it, but you can extend from an expression, right? As long as that expression returns a type or can be a self-executing thingy, it will totally work. Here we have a function called aggregation, which I won't go into all the details, but in a nutshell, inherits from the base class and takes all of the features off of all of these mix-ins and pops them on there, right? It creates another derived class, this combined class, which extends it and just mixes in all the mix-ins and it goes to town. And so here we have, this shape class, and then we have these two mix-ins, which have these initializers that get called when it gets fired off if the initializer exists. And you'll see that I've just created this rectangle that's extending from this and a couple of mix-ins. So I think it's kind of cool that you can do those things. And it's going to yield some bizarre libraries in JavaScript, but that's what JavaScript's for, is bizarre libraries. So I like JavaScript's bizarre libraries. It's like, whoa, that's crazy. It's dancing and it has eyeballs. Or that was just what I was drinking. Initializer is just something this guy made up. And if you take a look in here, it says for each of the mix-ins, like I believe within the constructor, it will actually call the initializer. So it will just go into the mix-ins and say, oh, do you have an initializer? We'll fire you off in the constructor for this. And notice the rest spread I was talking about, that's where you use it. Taking some arguments, pass it whatever the constructor is, pass it to the base constructor. So it's some cool stuff. I mean, I think it's neat. At the same time, I can see people doing weird things that may not be great ideas. And then I can see some really smart people saying, yeah, you thought it was weird, well, watch me do this. And it talks to you and makes you coffee, and you're like, that's amazing. Okay, so promises. How many of you guys work with promises? I imagine a lot of people do. Pretty much everybody. Is that like, should I even ask, or is it like, what's a promise? Okay, just want to, I don't want to be too, yeah, Hunter. Okay, so promises, of course, are ways to create asynchronous executing code. And they were around for a while, and the JavaScript community or the Ecmascript TC39 said, we're going to formally make them part of the JavaScript runtime library. So here this is how you would create a promise. You pass in it a function, which takes in resolve and reject, which are themselves functions, that whenever you asynchronously are done with something, if something succeeds, call resolve. If something fails, called reject. And this can happen within a timeout or something like that. I should have put that in a timeout. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll do that. Now, you guys get the idea, right? Okay. So here I'm going to just kind of show you a couple of, I'm creating a promise here, shows succeeded. This one fails. It shows that this has failed. This is a catch block, just like in promises there's a catch. There is no finally in the promise specification. I've seen a couple TC39 proposals about finally, but I don't think it's really going to happen. I've seen it. You can make your own polyfill. It will work just fine. So there's that. But what there is there is a promises all, right? So this takes in an array of promises. It takes its values and reduces them to an array of values. So it's a map-reduce sort of function in promises. It's kind of nice. And you'll see that by my code, you'll see that launch promises, even though it's at the end, actually shows up before these guys because they are asynchronous calls. All right. Am I doing okay on time? Because I only have a few left. Okay. Proxies. This is a neat one. And I think if you write karma tests or protractor tests or Jasmine tests doing something else, this is a cool little thing that you can use. So let me go ahead and do Control V. All right. So a proxy is basically aspect-oriented programming in JavaScript that says we will cross-cut any call to this object and we'll do something with it, whether or not an object supports that call. So in this example, we have an object literal called target. It has one member called foo. We're going to put that in a proxy that when you call it, every time you do get any property name, it will intercept that and say, before I do something with that, I'm going to do something else. In this case, it's going to say, hey, if that actually exists, show that. Otherwise, just show hello name. And first we try it with foo, and then we try it with world. Oh, look at that. I didn't copy it right. Sorry about that, folks. It's a good thing I caught that. So you can see that for foo, it says welcome foo, just fine. For the next one, hello world, it will actually receive that, and you can put in anything else there and it will execute. So the nice thing about this is that, you know, if there's some arbitrary functions that you really don't worry about the return values from, and you're creating some skeleton code for a test, you can just wrap it in a proxy and just say ignore for a lot of these guys. So it's kind of cool. I think there will be value for it as that, and also to clean up broken code. Okay, so yes.
Except for, I'm trying to figure out what you get from this that you couldn't just do it at rest. Isn't it just you get a reference to the sender?
Well, if you notice in the example, right, proxy.world doesn't exist, right? This is something that I'm just making up, and I'm trying to call it. So I could say proxy.padnug, right? And it's going to work and return a value. You can also put a function in there. So it does actually have value. You can't do this in vanilla JavaScript. And also, this has to be supported by the runtime. If the runtime doesn't have it, it doesn't work. I think it's kind of cool. Okay, proxies. Okay, finally, I have to actually do this one a little different. I did have enough content. That's good to know. Okay, repos. Nope, I did not. There's a reason why it's done last. No, I'll get to that. Unless Rich tells me I have to stop, I'll get to it. So let me go ahead and put this back to where it belongs. Save. Okay. So one of the things, oh great, and it worked. Okay, fantastic. One of the things that's a big deal, this is like to me the biggest feature of JavaScript that is not yet supported in any of the browsers is a common module system that is defined by the language. So depending upon what environment you're using, you may use CommonJS, which is your require syntax like you would do in Node or an AMD type thing. Or you might use something like Angular has. This is really great because it says, no, JavaScript has this, and you don't have to redefine it, and it has its own execution logic for loading. Another thing that it has that's super cool that you cannot do with require, although the utility is somewhat questionable but is kind of neat, is that you can have circular references between modules. So here I have an outer module that calls from inner, and here I have an inner module that calls from outer, and I can create instances of this class inside of there, and that works just fine, right? You can't do this with CommonJS. So if you've ever run into the need where you have a circular dependency, which is rare, you now can do it, and it's built into JavaScript. So kind of think that a couple things to keep in mind. When you have this import statement at the top, it's kind of like require. It will execute the call once, which may create a singleton if you have all your exports become singletons essentially, and then you can use them from that point forward. You can also just import from something if you just want to execute some startup code without actually having an object. You'll notice that I am using the in the squiggly brackets import, so there's been some discussion about this. Typescript does this a lot in AngularJS documentation. This is kind of nice because it, it ensures that you're always naming things the same thing within your code. You can have export default inner and then import name it whatever you want. So for frameworks like underscore, that's not a bad thing to do. But I think for your own code, this is a pretty good standard to follow. Airbnb says different, but I think this is actually pretty cool. Okay, so somebody said, what about that async stuff? So everything I've been running so far is Webpack. And basically all Webpack does is it finds things that are module related and bundles them up. But everything else as far as JavaScript, it just kind of plops in there. And so whatever the browser runs, it runs. Async functions, which are not promises, they're actually promises that are lexically supported, look a lot like C# async stuff, don't exist yet on any runtime. So in order to get this to work, I'm going to have to run this through Babel, but it will work when I do that. So let me go ahead and make a couple changes. So here is my Webpack here, and you'll see I've put this Babel loader in here to do some magical stuff. Basically, we'll transpile it, and it's targeting 2017. And I'm going to go and just kill this guy, and I'm going to run it again. Give it a second. Okay, so now we're back to there. And now I'm going to go ahead and load up my async functions. This will be the finale for the day. I think I timed this all right. What do you think? All right? Cool. I wasn't sure. You never know. I thought I'd have to make up some stuff. Okay, boom. So here you will see, this is kind of a semi-elaborate example, but not too elaborate, right? Here I have this async function, right, which is just like an async function kind of in C#, except it boils down to, what are they in C#? They're in .NET, they're tasks, aren't they? They boil down to tasks. These boil down to promises, right? These are essentially promises at the end of the day. So function do it is the same as calling return promise and having some subroutine that essentially does a resolve and reject like here. But it doesn't look like a promise. It looks like your standard sequential code, synchronous code. So here we have this complete async that says try something. If everything works great, return. If it fails, throw this. And you will see when I call the first one, right, I'm passing a value and it just shows the result. And you can see I'm actually now using it as a promise. And then when I call async fail, I try it again. It doesn't show success, it just shows failed. And then you'll also see that it does completed async calls at the beginning to show that all this stuff happens afterwards. Right?
Very recently, basic support has been added to all the evergreen browsers except for Microsoft's.
Well, there you go.
So, Chrome 55, Firefox 52, and Opera Safari.
There you go.
I don't know what basic support means. It sounds like not the entire spec has been implemented. But
Well, it gets weird when you start getting into, I think it might be, So one of the things that's interesting about async, and one of the things I didn't go over, were generators. So you can create your own generator functions as well, like the yield stuff that you do in C#. You can do that in JavaScript too. And there's a pattern that you can actually do asynchronous coding with generators, which looks very similar to this, but it's a little weird. But there's a couple things that it actually can't do that this spec covers. So I don't know. But that's really interesting news. It moves quickly, I'll tell you. It moves super quickly. But there you have it in a nutshell. It's kind of, JavaScript is, hopefully what you get is, wow, look at all these new things you can do in JavaScript. It's not the same as it was a while ago. If you're using the module system that's built into JavaScript, you can write some really nice, clean, manageable code, especially if you keep your naming consistent, which is a lot easier to do now in JavaScript with its destructuring and default assignments. So if you're going to take anything from this, one, there's a lot of cool things, and two, there's some cool things that actually help make this dynamic code a heck of a lot more manageable. So you guys have been great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the good questions. Yeah. Any other questions before we go in the raffle? Like any quick ones?
What about like coding with this and old browsers and, you know, there was the shim, you know,
Yeah.
JavaScript thing for a while, you know, the normalize, or, you know, back in the,
So,
you know, we had to catch up.
So what you can do is, my last example was using Babel, which you can actually set a setting to Babel to say, transpile all of this except for things like proxies and a couple other features that I mentioned down to Ecmascript 5. And that will run on pretty much anything. So again, like if there's a couple tools that you may want to use. If you know that you're targeting two browsers that have 99% coverage, just use Webpack, right? Because Webpack pretty much just does the module bundling. Or you could, there's a polyfill for modules too if you want it to be, instead of pre-compile loaded but dynamically loaded by the browser, you just use that. If you know that you are targeting many browsers and you're not sure, or you have to target older browsers, but you want to use this cool goodness, then use Babel and use it within some sort of bundler. You can also use it with system.js. Those will pretty much run on any of the older browsers. I mean, it's not going to run on Mosaic, right? But it will run on probably IE6 and above. So, for some things. But yeah, I mean, there's choices you can make depending upon if you have a product that needs a large market share of browsers, or if you're targeting like Electron. You know, there's like 3 browsers you care about.
TypeScript.
TypeScript, great stuff.
Invented because for people who went to computer science school and didn't want to deal with JavaScript.
I don't know if
Didn't make sense,
maybe. Yeah.
So how close do you think it is so that making JavaScript be so awesome that TypeScript is obsolete?
Well, I think it really comes down to the developer and the team and whether or not they value static typing and dynamic typing. And they both have strengths and they both have caveats. So if you are on a very large development team that has a not so rigorous testing structure, I can see TypeScript being a very good choice. And if it's line of business code, I could see it maybe being the only choice, especially if the developers come from either Java or a C# background and they're just throwing some things together in Angular 2, because it seems like that's where that is going. Conversely, right, you're wanting to build really custom UIs that have to be really fast, and you don't want to spend a lot of time doing interface definitions to get it to work. I think that modern JavaScript is a fantastic choice, especially if you have a really good testing culture. So I think it really just matters, the developer, the practice, but really good question.
What a full answer.
There you go. I have a thought or two, so that's my